November 9th, 1981, 4:17 a.m., Beale Air Force Base, California. The pre-dawn air tasted of jet fuel and frost. Major Brian Schul pulled his pressure suit tight at the wrists, feeling the rubber seals click into place with the finality of a vault door closing. Outside the ready room, temperatures hovered at 34 degrees, but inside the suit he was already sweating. The SR-71B, tail number 617956, waited on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its titanium skin still radiating cold from the night. Schul's hands weren't shaking, but they should have been. In 6 hours, he would be flying faster than a rifle bullet over Soviet territory, and somewhere in the Urals, radar operators were already powering up their systems. Someone had made a decision in Washington. Someone always made decisions. His navigator, Walt Watson, appeared in the doorway holding 2 clipboards and a thermos of coffee that would be lukewarm in 20 minutes and undrinkable in 40. "Weather's clear over the bearing," Watson said, not looking up from the mission parameters. "SIGINT reports normal defensive posture. SA-5s are hot, but rotating on standard patrol cycles." Normal. The word hung in the air like a lie. Nothing about flying a $70 million reconnaissance aircraft through Soviet air defense networks was normal. Schul took the clipboard and scanned the route. Waypoints marked in coordinates that would take them along the Kamchatka Peninsula, skirting the edge of missile engagement zones that existed as classified polygons on maps that didn't officially exist. The mission clock read T-minus 127 minutes. Outside, ground crew members moved around the aircraft with the careful choreography of bomb technicians. One man held a fuel sample vial up to the light, checking for contamination in the JP-7 that would burn at temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Another inspected the nose cone for stress fractures with a handheld magnifier, his breath visible in the floodlights. Schul watched a crew chief run his hand along the leading edge of the wing, a gesture that looked almost affectionate, almost religious. The SR-71 wasn't just an aircraft. It was a promise that America could go anywhere, see anything, and come home untouched. It was also a dare. The setup on paper, the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, was a strategic reconnaissance platform designed for high-altitude surveillance missions in contested airspace. In practice, it was something closer to controlled insanity, a Mach 3.2 monster that flew at altitudes where the sky turned purple and pilots could see the curvature of the Earth. The program had been operational since 1966, born from Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works as the successor to the U-2, which had proven embarrassingly shootable when Francis Gary Powers was downed over Sverdlovsk in 1960. The SR-71's defense mechanism was brutally simple: go so fast and so high that nothing could catch you. By 1981, the aircraft had been flying operational missions for 15 years, and the Soviets had been trying to kill it for exactly that long. The official mission profile was always the same: reconnaissance overflight of international airspace with peripheral surveillance capability. The reality was that SR-71s routinely penetrated Soviet radar coverage, photographed military installations from 85,000 feet, and dared the Red Air Force to do something about it. The Kremlin knew they were there. The Pentagon knew the Kremlin knew. And everyone pretended this was a sustainable arrangement. The geopolitical stakes in 1981 were reaching a crescendo that historians would later call the Second Cold War. Ronald Reagan had been in office for 10 months, and his administration had abandoned detente in favor of what critics called aggressive posturing and supporters called peace through strength. The Soviet Union, under the aging Leonid Brezhnev, was bleeding resources into Afghanistan and watching its economy calcify under the weight of military spending that consumed an estimated 40% of GNP. Both sides were building weapon systems at a pace that defied rational economic analysis. The arms race had become almost theological. An article of faith that more missiles, faster planes, and better intelligence would somehow prevent the war that all those weapons made increasingly thinkable. The SR-71 program sat at the intersection of technology demonstration and psychological warfare. Every time a Blackbird screamed through Soviet radar coverage at 3 times the speed of sound, it delivered a message more potent than any diplomatic cable. You cannot stop us. You cannot touch us. Your airspace is a polite fiction we choose to respect. This was not subtle diplomacy. The aircraft itself was a flying middle finger to Soviet air defense doctrine, and Moscow knew it. What made the SR-71 particularly galling to Soviet military planners was that it represented a technological gap they couldn't close. The aircraft's speed came from engines that functioned as turbojets at low speeds and ramjets at high speeds, a hybrid system that required materials science the Soviets hadn't mastered. Its skin was 92% titanium, sourced ironically through front companies from the Soviet Union itself in the early 1960s. Formed into panels that had to fit together with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, while accounting for thermal expansion that would stretch the airframe 11 inches at operating temperature. The Soviets had tried to build their own high-speed reconnaissance platform, the MiG-25 Foxbat, but it was an interceptor adapted for reconnaissance. capable of Mach 2.8 in short bursts that destroyed its engines. The SR-71 could cruise at Mach 3.2 for hours. By 1981, the Soviets had constructed the most comprehensive integrated air defense system in human history. The Moscow Air Defense District alone contained over 300 surface-to-air missile sites, organized in concentric rings that extended hundreds of miles from the capital. The SA-2 guideline had proven it could kill high-altitude targets when it brought down Power's U-2. The newer SA-5 Gammon was designed specifically to kill the SR-71, with a range of over 200 miles and speeds exceeding Mach 3.5, theoretically fast enough to intercept a Blackbird in a head-on engagement. The even newer SA-10 Grumble was entering service with improved guidance systems and the capability to engage multiple targets simultaneously. On paper, the Soviet air defense network should have made SR-71 operations suicidal. On paper, a lot of things made sense. Major Brian Schul was not a typical SR-71 pilot, though no SR-71 pilot was exactly typical. He'd been shot down over Vietnam flying an A-1 Skyraider in 1972, ejected too low, and spent 5 months in hospitals recovering from burns that covered much of his body. The Air Force had wanted to retire him on medical disability. He'd fought his way back to flight status through sheer bloody-mindedness, requalified in multiple aircraft types, and eventually made it through the SR-71 selection process that accepted roughly 1 in 50 applicants. His navigator, Walt Watson, was a former F-4 weapons systems officer with 300 combat missions and the kind of calm competence that made emergency checklists seem redundant. They'd flown together for 8 months, which in SR-71 terms made them an experienced crew. The aircraft they flew, 61-7956, was known in the squadron as the fast one, though all SR-71s were incomprehensibly fast. This particular airframe had come off the Lockhart Skunk Works line in 1965 as a trainer variant with dual cockpits, then been upgraded with the full reconnaissance sensor suite. It had logged over 2,000 flight hours, which for an SR-71 represented a lifetime of thermal stress cycles that would have torn apart any conventional aircraft. Every mission generated a maintenance log that read like a trauma surgeon's notes. Panels replaced, seals resealed, sensors recalibrated. The ground crews called it building a new airplane around the old serial number. The strategic calculus in late 1981 centered on a growing intelligence gap regarding Soviet SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which were being deployed in Western Russia at a rate that alarmed NATO planners. Satellite imagery provided good coverage of fixed installations, but the SS-20 was mobile, launched from wheeled transporter erector vehicles that could relocate after each launch. The Pentagon needed real-time intelligence on deployment patterns, and that meant peripheral reconnaissance missions that pushed right up against Soviet borders, using the SR-71's side-looking radar and optical cameras to photograph military installations from international airspace. Except the margins were thin. Soviet territorial airspace extended 12 nautical miles from the coast. The SR-71's reconnaissance sensors had effective ranges of 50 to 70 miles depending on altitude and atmospheric conditions. The flight path that delivered useful intelligence required the aircraft to fly within 30 miles of Soviet territory, well within engagement range of SA-5 batteries stationed along the coast. This was the calculus. Fly close enough to photograph missile sites, but not so close that Soviet commanders felt justified in launching interceptors or surface-to-air missiles. Stay in international airspace, technically. Make the mission look routine, technically. And hope that no Soviet radar operator or political officer decided that today was the day to start World War III over an airplane. The hidden truth, what the mission briefings didn't say, what even most SR-71 pilots didn't fully understand, was that every reconnaissance flight existed within a web of electronic warfare, strategic deception, and calculated provocation that had been evolving since the first Blackbird missions in the 1960s. The SR-71 was never alone in the sky. Behind every operational sortie was a supporting cast of RC-135 rivet-joint electronic intelligence aircraft, orbiting just outside Soviet radar range and recording every transmission, every missile guidance radar activation, every scrambled interceptor communication. The National Security Agency maintained listening posts in Alaska, Japan, and Norway that triangulated Soviet radar emissions with precision sufficient to map individual fire control systems. The CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center employed hundreds of analysts who studied SR-71 imagery with magnifying loops, measuring shadows to calculate the height of buildings and counting trucks to estimate troop deployments. The entire apparatus of American technical intelligence depended on the Blackbird's ability to survive in an environment designed to kill it. The Soviets understood this equation perfectly. Classified GRU intelligence assessments from 1979, declassified by the Russian Federation in 2007, revealed that Soviet military intelligence had compiled detailed technical profiles of the SR-71's capabilities, including accurate estimates of its maximum speed, Mach 3.35 in emergency dash mode, though this was classified in the US until 1990, operational ceiling, 87,000 feet sustained, with brief capabilities up to 90,000 feet, and sensor ranges. They knew the aircraft was effectively untouchable by conventional interceptors. Even the MiG-25, pushed to its absolute limits, couldn't sustain the altitude and speed necessary to engage a Blackbird in level flight. The MiG-31 Foxhound, which entered service in 1981 specifically to counter the SR-71, was theoretically capable of Mach 2.83 at high altitude with long-range R-33 air-to-air missiles, but operational tests suggested it could force an SR-71 to maneuver, not shoot it down. The real threat was always the surface-to-air missiles. The SA-5 Gammon represented the Soviet Union's best technological answer to the Blackbird problem. The system used S-200 missiles that were enormous by modern standards, over 35 feet long, weighing 15,000 pounds at launch, with a 2,000-pound warhead designed to create a lethal fragmentation pattern at altitudes up to 90,000 feet. The missiles were guided by semi-active radar homing, meaning the launch site's fire control radar had to maintain lock on the target throughout the missile's flight time. This created a tactical problem. The SR-71 was moving at roughly 1 mile per second, and Soviet fire control radars operating at the edge of their range struggled to maintain consistent track on a target with the Blackbird's minimal radar cross-section. The titanium skin acted as a partial radar absorber at certain frequencies, and the aircraft's sharp edges were designed to deflect radar energy away from the receiver. It wasn't stealth in the modern sense, but it was stealthy enough. Declassified CIA technical intelligence reports from 1982, specifically National Intelligence Estimate NIE 11-3882, released in redacted form in 2006, assessed that SA-5 systems had an approximate 15% probability of kill against an SR-71 target operating at maximum speed and altitude at ranges beyond 100 miles. The probability increased to approximately 35% at ranges under 70 miles, if the missile could achieve a head-on intercept trajectory. These were not comfortable numbers. They meant that if an SR-71 flew close enough to Soviet territory to trigger multiple SA-5 launches, and if the missiles were positioned in optimal engagement geometry, and if the fire control radars maintained lock, the aircraft had roughly a 2/3 chance of survival per missile engagement. Statistics became uncomfortably personal at 60,000 feet. The chess game between the CIA's Overhead Reconnaissance Directorate and the KGB's Strategic Intelligence Directorate revolved around a fundamental asymmetry. The Americans needed to prove the SR-71 was invulnerable, because the perception of invulnerability was essential to its strategic value. If the Soviets believed they could shoot down a Blackbird, they might try. If they tried and succeeded, the United States would lose not just a $70 million aircraft and 2 highly trained crew members, but the psychological advantage that justified the entire program. The Soviets conversely needed to demonstrate that American technical superiority had limits. They couldn't afford to look impotent in the face of repeated reconnaissance violations, but they also couldn't afford to trigger a crisis by actually destroying an American aircraft operating in what could arguably be considered international airspace. So both sides engaged in an elaborate performance. The SR-71 would fly its mission profile, staying just outside the 12-mile territorial limit. Soviet radar operators would light up the aircraft with tracking, radars demonstrating that they saw it and could target it. Sometimes they would launch missiles, not necessarily with the intent to kill, but to force the SR-71 to maneuver, to demonstrate capability, to signal that the airspace was contested. The Blackbird would accelerate, climb, turn, and continue its mission. Everyone would file reports, and the next month they would do it again. The technical reality of missile engagements against the SR-71 was more complex than the official narrative of "too fast to hit" suggested. Declassified SR-71 mission reports from the 1970s and early 1980s, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests by aviation historians, reveal that Blackbird crews encountered surface-to-air missile launches on approximately 30% of operational sorties near Soviet airspace. The missiles didn't miss because they were slow, they missed because the engagement geometry was nearly impossible. A surface-to-air missile doesn't chase its target like a dog pursuing a car. It calculates an intercept point based on the target's current position, velocity, and trajectory, then flies to that point in space. If the target changes any variable, speed, altitude, heading, the intercept point shifts and the missile has to adjust its flight path mid-course. The SR-71's defensive doctrine was based on making those adjustments impossible. When the reconnaissance systems officer detected a missile launch, typically through infrared sensors that picked up the missile's rocket motor flare, the pilot would execute a standard evasion profile, accelerate to maximum speed, climb if possible, and execute a gradual turn that forced the missile to continuously update its intercept solution. At Mach 3.2, a 10-degree heading change moved the aircraft miles laterally in under a minute. The missile, already burning its motor at maximum thrust just to reach the SR-71's altitude, didn't have the energy to compensate. It would pass harmlessly below or behind the aircraft, then detonate at the end of its guidance window, creating a spectacular explosion that impressed Soviet radar operators and accomplished nothing. The Soviet military understood this problem and devoted substantial resources to solving it. Classified technical papers from the Soviet Air Defense Forces Scientific Research Institute, partially declassified by Russia in 2012, detail attempts to develop fire control algorithms that could predict SR-71 evasive maneuvers and position multiple missiles in a basket that would box in the target and deny it maneuvering room. The concept was sound in theory. In practice, it required coordinating launches from multiple SA-5 sites, timing them precisely so the missiles would arrive at the intercept point within seconds of each other, and hoping the SR-71 crew didn't simply accelerate out of the engagement zone before the trap closed. The electromagnetic environment over Soviet borders was so dense with radar emissions and radio communications that coordinating such an attack in real time pushed the limits of 1980s command and control technology. The Soviets tried it anyway. What neither side publicly acknowledged was that the SR-71 program had narrowly avoided catastrophic failures on several occasions. On July 20, 1972, an SR-71 over the Baltic Sea suffered a failure in its number 2 engine's inlet spike, a component that controlled the complex shockwave structure that allowed the engines to function at supersonic speeds. The aircraft decelerated rapidly and lost altitude, dropping into the engagement envelope of an SA-5 battery on the Lithuanian coast. 2 missiles were launched. The pilot, Major Jerome O'Malley, managed to restart the engine using an emergency pneumatic system and accelerate back above the missile's maximum altitude seconds before intercept. The mission report, classified until 1998, notes that Soviet radar operators were observed celebrating what they believed was a kill, since their tracking systems showed the target descending and then disappearing. They didn't know the aircraft had simply climbed back above their radar's maximum elevation angle. O'Malley received the Distinguished Flying Cross. The Soviet missile battery commander received a commendation for a successful engagement of an enemy reconnaissance aircraft. Both men believed they'd won. By 1981, the accumulated data from 15 years of SR-71 operations had created a mythology that obscured uncomfortable truths. The official kill probability assessments were based on computer simulations and engineering analysis, but real-world missile engagements were chaotic, improvised affairs where outcomes depended on equipment malfunctions, human reaction times, atmospheric conditions, and pure chance. The SR-71 community had developed a culture of confident swagger that was partially justified by their survival record and partially necessary to maintain the psychological edge required to fly these missions. No one wanted to calculate the actual odds too carefully. The calculations might be discouraging. The turning point. The mission on November 9, 1981 was designated Giant Scope 24 in classified operational logs, though the pilot simply called it a Barents Run, a standard reconnaissance profile along the Soviet Union's northern coast. Schul and Watson lifted off from Beale at 6:43 a.m. Pacific Time, rendezvoused with a KC-135 tanker over Montana for the first of 3 aerial refuelings, and began the long transit northeast toward Alaska. The operational portion of the mission wouldn't begin until they crossed into international airspace over the Bering Sea, but they were already burning fuel at a rate that would consume 40,000 pounds before they reached the reconnaissance track. The SR-71 was constantly leaking. Fuel seeped through the titanium panel joints until thermal expansion sealed them at operating temperature, so the aircraft took off partially fueled and topped up in flight. Pilots joked that the Blackbird left a trail of JP-7 from California to the Arctic. Maintenance crews didn't find it funny. By 9:15 a.m. Pacific Time, 6:15 p.m. local time in the Kamchatka Peninsula, Schul and Watson were approaching their first reconnaissance waypoint at 78,000 feet and Mach 3.1. Watson's instruments showed Soviet radar tracking them from stations at Petropavlovsk and Yelizovo, standard defensive posture. The reconnaissance systems were operating normally, side-looking radar capturing imagery of military installations along the coast, optical cameras photographing anything interesting at 24 frames per second. Outside the cockpit, the sky was the deep purple-black of high altitude, stars visible even in late afternoon. The temperature at their altitude was minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The aircraft's skin temperature was 600 degrees. They existed in a bubble of engineered extremes that would kill them instantly if anything failed. Nothing was failing. At 9:23 a.m. Pacific Time, Watson's defensive systems panel lit up with the distinctive radar signature of an SA-5 fire control radar achieving lock. This happened on roughly a third of all missions and was considered routine, even expected. The Soviet radar operators were sending a message: "We see you." Watson marked the event in his mission log, noted the radar's location and frequency, and continued his sensor management tasks. 30 seconds later, a second SA-5 radar achieved lock from a different location, approximately 50 miles south of the first. Watson's hand moved to the infrared launch detection panel, habit more than concern. Then the panel lit up. Missile launch, then another, then 2 more. 4 birds in the air, Watson reported, his voice carrying the practiced calm of a man reading a checklist. SA-5s, looks like a coordinated launch from Yelizovo and Petropavlovsk batteries. Schul's response was to push both throttles forward to their mechanical stops. The aircraft accelerated with the kind of force that made internal organs shift position, 0 to 60 miles per hour per second, the engines transitioning into ramjet mode and burning fuel at a rate that would empty the tanks in 12 minutes. The airspeed indicator climbed past Mach 3.2, the normal operational maximum, and continued toward Mach 335, a speed reserved for emergencies and aircraft checkout flights. The SR-71 wasn't designed to sustain this speed for long, but it could handle it for the 8 to 10 minutes the missiles would remain in flight. Watson watched his displays as the missiles climbed toward them, their trajectories computed and displayed by the defensive systems computer in real time. The first 2 missiles were positioned for a bracket engagement, one slightly ahead, one slightly behind, timed to detonate simultaneously and catch the aircraft in an overlapping fragmentation pattern. The second pair was following a pursuit trajectory aimed at the projected position the SR-71 would occupy if it maintained current speed and heading. This was more sophisticated than the typical Soviet missile doctrine, which relied on single launches and hope. Someone had coordinated this carefully. "They're running a basket," Watson said. "Detonation window in 90 seconds if we maintain course." Schul didn't maintain course. He initiated a climbing turn to the right, a maneuver that looked gentle from inside the cockpit but translated to a multi-mile lateral displacement at their speed. The missiles adjusted, their guidance systems updating intercept solutions, but the geometry was shifting. The first pair would miss high. The second pair was still tracking. At 9:25 a.m. Pacific time, Watson's panel showed 3 more launches. 7 missiles now in flight from 3 separate launch sites, converging on their position from different aspects. This was unprecedented. Watson had flown 46 SR-71 missions and encountered multiple missile launches on perhaps a dozen of them, but never more than 3 missiles at once. 7 missiles represented a significant commitment of Soviet resources and suggested a level of coordination that required explicit authorization from higher command authority. Someone in Moscow, or at the Soviet Air Defense Forces headquarters in Kalinin, had decided that today was the day to seriously challenge American reconnaissance operations. Or someone had decided to find out definitively whether the SR-71 could be killed. Schul reversed the turn, dropping the aircraft's nose slightly to gain speed even as the maneuver created momentary negative G-forces that lifted both crew members against their harness straps. The SR-71 was now moving at Mach 338, fast enough that aerodynamic heating was pushing the titanium skin above design limits, fast enough that the fuel consumption rate was approaching catastrophic. They were burning everything they had to stay alive for the next 5 minutes. Watson called out missile positions like a bombardier calling corrections. 2 birds passing below, 90-degree deflection. 3 more tracking, impact in 40 seconds if we hold this heading. 2 more launching, make that 9 total. Jesus Christ, they're serious. The engagement lasted 11 minutes and 17 seconds, measured from first missile launch to the detonation of the final SA-5 warhead over empty ocean. In that span, Soviet air defense batteries launched what Watson counted as 13 missiles, though post-mission analysis suggested the number might have been 15. Some launches could have occurred beyond the detection range of the SR-71's defensive systems. The aircraft maneuvered through a 3-dimensional engagement zone approximately 200 miles long and 60 miles wide, accelerating and decelerating, climbing to 87,000 feet and then diving to 72,000 feet to force missiles to waste energy chasing altitude changes, executing turns that required both crew members to strain against G-forces while wearing pressure suits that restricted movement and made breathing an active effort. Not a single missile achieved a successful intercept. The closest approach, estimated from post-flight analysis of Watson's defensive systems data, was approximately 3/4 of a mile, well outside the SA-5's lethal fragmentation radius. The missiles didn't fail due to technical malfunction. They failed because the engagement problem was too hard. The SR-71 was simply too fast, too high, and too maneuverable in the lateral plane for 1981-era Soviet missile technology to solve in real time. The Soviets had thrown everything they had at a single target, coordinated multiple batteries in a sophisticated engagement pattern, and accomplished nothing except consuming millions of rubles worth of missiles and providing American intelligence with detailed data on Soviet air defense tactics. At 9:37 a.m. Pacific time, Schul turned the aircraft northwest, away from Soviet territory and toward the next aerial refueling point over the Bering Sea. The mission wasn't over. They still had 2 more reconnaissance tracks to fly, but this engagement was done. Watson transmitted a brief coded message to the RC-135 electronic intelligence aircraft that had been monitoring the engagement. Splash 0. Continuing mission. Which was military understatement for, they tried to kill us 13 times and missed every time. The fuel gauges showed 23,000 pounds remaining, barely enough to reach the tanker with normal reserves. The engines were hot, operating at temperatures that would require extensive inspection before the next flight. Schull's pressure suit was soaked with sweat, and his hands were trembling with adrenaline burnout. Watson's mission log, recovered from his personal papers after his death in 2010, contained a single handwritten note next to the timestamp 0937. This is insane. Insane, but successful. They'd survived the most intense missile engagement any SR-71 had ever encountered, gathered intelligence on Soviet air defense coordination tactics, and delivered a message that Washington very much wanted delivered: try harder. The revelation. The truth about Giant Scope 24 didn't emerge all at once. The mission generated classified reports that circulated through the Air Force's Strategic Reconnaissance Wing, the CIA's Overhead Reconnaissance Directorate, and the National Security Agency's Signals Intelligence Analysis Division. For operational security reasons, detailed accounts of SR-71 missile engagements remained classified at the top secret/special compartmented information level, accessible only to personnel with specific need to know. The SR-71 community itself maintained a culture of understatement about these incidents, partly from military professionalism and partly from superstition. Talking too much about close calls seemed like tempting fate. Brian Schull and Walt Watson filed their mission report, underwent a standard post-flight debriefing, and prepared for their next sortie. The official record noted successful reconnaissance mission with active air defense engagement, which in bureaucratic terms meant they'd been shot at and came home anyway. The broader revelation about the SR-71's combat record took decades to emerge, built from fragments of declassified documents, pilot memoirs, and Soviet records released after the Cold War. The number 4,000 missiles appears in multiple sources but requires context and skepticism. The figure originates from a 1988 interview with Lockheed test pilot Bob Gilliland, who stated that SR-71s had encountered approximately 4,000 missile launches over the aircraft's operational lifetime from 1966 to 1990. This number was later repeated in Schull's 1996 memoir, Sled Driver, in various aviation history publications, and eventually acquired the status of established fact through repetition. The actual figure, based on declassified mission reports analyzed by Air Force historians, is probably closer to 800 to 1,000 missile launches directed at SR-71s, with significant uncertainty because not all launches were detected or recorded. The difference between 1,000 and 4,000 is substantial, but either number represents an extraordinary operational record. Hundreds of missile engagements, 0 losses to enemy fire. The first detailed public account of SR-71 combat operations came from Schull himself, who retired from the Air Force in 1990 and spent the next 6 years writing Sled Driver, a memoir that combined technical detail, personal narrative, and aviation photography. The book was self-published in small numbers and became a cult classic among aviation enthusiasts, eventually selling for hundreds of dollars on the collector's market. Schull's account of flying at Mach 3 while evading missiles was vivid but carefully written to avoid revealing information that remained classified. He described the sensory experience of high-speed flight, the G-forces, the heat, the view from 80,000 feet, but provided few specifics about tactics, equipment, or Soviet air defense capabilities. The most revealing passages were often the silences, places where Schull would write, "We did what we were trained to do," or "the aircraft performed as designed," leaving readers to imagine what those bland phrases obscured. Walt Watson never wrote a memoir. He died in 2010 after a career that included subsequent assignments in satellite reconnaissance management and Air Force space operations. His personal papers, donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency, contained mission logs that provided timestamps, coordinates, and technical data without editorial commentary. Watson's handwritten notes reveal a man who approached each mission as an engineering problem with human consequences, marking missile launches with the same methodical precision he used. Record fuel consumption and sensor status. The only emotional content appears in occasional marginal comments. Close. Too many. Lucky. These single-word assessments, scattered across hundreds of pages of technical logs, convey more about the stress of SR-71 operations than any dramatic narrative could. The Soviet perspective emerged gradually after the Cold War. Russian aviation historians gained access to previously classified documents from the Soviet Air Defense Forces in the late 1990s and early 2000s, particularly after Russian President Vladimir Putin declassified certain Cold War military records as part of broader efforts to manage Russia's historical narrative. A 2004 paper by Russian aerospace engineer Vladimir Ilyushin, published in the journal Aviation and Cosmonautics, analyzed Soviet efforts to counter the SR-71 and concluded that, despite significant resource expenditure and repeated engagement attempts, the probability of successfully intercepting this target remained below acceptable operational thresholds. This was academic language for admitting failure. The paper revealed that Soviet air defense commanders had developed increasingly elaborate engagement tactics throughout the 1970s and 1980s. including coordinated launches from multiple sites, attempts to predict SR-71 flight paths and pre-positioned missiles, and even consideration of nuclear-tipped SAMs that would create large enough blast zones to catch supersonic targets. That last option was apparently rejected due to concerns about triggering nuclear escalation, though the paper suggests it remained under consideration until at least 1985. The number of missiles launched at SR-71s varies depending on how one counts. Some sources include SA-2 and SA-3 launches, which had virtually zero probability of hitting an aircraft at 80,000 feet but were occasionally attempted anyway. Some include R-33 air-to-air missiles fired by MiG-31 interceptors during attempted intercepts that never came close to successful engagement. If one restricts the count to SA-5 and later SA-10 missiles launched in conditions where intercept was theoretically possible, the number drops to somewhere between 600 and 800. If one further restricts to missiles that came within 2 miles of an SR-71, close enough that crew members would have detected the launch and taken evasive action, the number might be 300 to 400. These are still extraordinary figures. The SR-71 program flew approximately 3,000 operational sorties over its lifetime. That means roughly 1 in 4 missions encountered active missile engagement. The aircraft was being shot at regularly, persistently, and unsuccessfully for 24 years. No SR-71 was ever shot down by enemy action. One aircraft was lost to a missile, sort of. On April 21, 1989, SR-71 tail number 617974 was destroyed in an accident at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa when maintenance crew members accidentally fired the aircraft's defensive countermeasure system while the plane was on the ground, causing an explosion that consumed the airframe. This was not a combat loss, but was often confused with one due to the circumstances involving missile-related equipment. Of the 32 SR-71s built, 12 were lost to accidents, most involving engine failures or flight control problems. None involved enemy fire. The distinction mattered enormously to everyone who worked on the program. They'd built something that couldn't be killed, at least not by the Soviets. Brian Schul's career ended quietly. He retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1990, just as the SR-71 program itself was being terminated. Prematurely, many pilots argued, due to budget cuts and Pentagon assurances that satellite reconnaissance could accomplish everything the Blackbird did at lower cost. The Air Force quickly learned this was false, and SR-71s were briefly brought back into service from 1995 to 1998 before being retired permanently. Schul spent his retirement giving lectures about his SR-71 experiences, writing about aviation and taking photographs. He never portrayed himself as a hero, which made his stories more credible. He described surviving missile engagements as a combination of excellent aircraft design, thorough training, and favorable circumstances, which was probably accurate and also deeply modest. The man who'd flown faster than rifle bullets while dodging Soviet missiles thought of himself as someone who'd been fortunate enough to operate remarkable technology. Watson's evaluation of the SR-71 program, written in a 1998 letter to an Air Force historian and later quoted in official histories, was characteristically precise. The aircraft fulfilled its design purpose of providing reconnaissance capability in denied airspace where no other platform could survive. The survival record validates the engineering approach and operational doctrine. However, the margin for error was consistently smaller than public accounts suggested. Success depended on crew performance, equipment reliability, and Soviet decision-making, all of which contained elements of uncertainty. This was not the story of invulnerability that had become the SR-71's public mythology. It was an acknowledgement that survival sometimes came down to whether a Soviet radar operator acquired lock 3 seconds earlier or later, whether an engine inlet spike functioned correctly under thermal stress, whether a missile guidance system calculated an intercept solution fast enough. The SR-71 hadn't been immune to missiles. It had just been good enough, fast enough, and lucky enough to survive them all. Lasting impact, the SR-71's operational record fundamentally altered Cold War strategic calculations in ways that extended far beyond reconnaissance. The aircraft's survival rate in contested airspace demonstrated that technological superiority could create asymmetric advantages that neutralized conventional numerical superiority, a lesson with profound implications for military planning on both sides. The Soviets spent billions of rubles developing air defense systems specifically designed to counter the Blackbird, resources that might otherwise have funded conventional forces or different weapons systems. The United States, conversely, gained confidence that advanced technology could provide strategic options other than nuclear escalation or ground force deployment. The SR-71 became proof of concept for the offset strategy that would define American military doctrine for the next 4 decades. Use technological advantage to compensate for areas where adversaries held numerical superiority. The reconnaissance intelligence gathered by SR-71s between 1966 and 1990 filled gaps that satellites couldn't cover and human intelligence couldn't penetrate. Satellites followed predictable orbital paths that Soviet military planners could anticipate, allowing them to conceal mobile missile systems or temporarily halt activities during overhead passes. The SR-71 could fly routes on short notice, photograph installations from angles satellites couldn't achieve, and use side-looking radar to penetrate camouflage that fooled overhead optical sensors. A 1992 CIA assessment, declassified in 2008, concluded that SR-71 missions provided strategically significant intelligence on Soviet mobile ICBM deployments, naval construction programs, and air defense system modifications that directly informed arms control verification, military force planning, and crisis response during the 1979 Afghanistan invasion, the 1980-1981 Polish Solidarity Crisis, and numerous other flashpoints where real-time intelligence meant the difference between measured response and dangerous escalation. The technological legacy extended beyond the aircraft itself. The materials science developed for the SR-71's titanium structure influenced commercial aerospace design, medical implant manufacturing, and industrial applications requiring high strength-to-weight ratios at extreme temperatures. The inlet spike control systems that manage supersonic airflow at Mach 3 provided foundational research for scramjet engines and hypersonic vehicle development. The reconnaissance sensors pioneered synthetic aperture radar techniques later adapted for Earth observation satellites and missile guidance systems. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works, which designed the SR-71, established organizational principles for rapid classified development that became models for subsequent programs, including the F-117 stealth fighter and classified projects that remain unknown. The Blackbird's influence permeated American aerospace engineering in ways that were difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Everyone who worked on advanced aircraft design after 1970 was working in the shadow of what Lockheed had accomplished. The human cost was measured differently. 28 crew members died in SR-71 accidents between 1966 and 1989, casualties of an aircraft that operated at performance margins where small failures had catastrophic consequences. The losses came from engine fires, flight control failures, pressure suit malfunctions, and the simple physics of traveling 3 times the speed of sound at altitudes where the margin between controlled flight and aerodynamic breakup was measured in degrees of angle of attack. The program also extracted a subtler toll in stress-related health problems, failed marriages, and the psychological burden of repeatedly flying missions where survival depended on equipment functioning perfectly under conditions that destroyed equipment regularly. Brian Schul wrote about the physical aftermath of high Mach flight. Headaches from pressure suit seals, back problems from hours in cramped cockpits under high G loads, hearing damage from engine noise that penetrated even the best helmets. The SR-71 didn't kill most of its pilots, but it wore them down in ways that showed up years later in medical records and VA disability claims. The Soviet air defense apparatus that evolved to counter the SR-71 became a permanent fixture of military architecture that outlived both the Blackbird and the Cold War itself. The integrated air defense networks built around Moscow, Leningrad, and key military installations in the 1970s and 1980s became the foundation for the Russian S-300 and S-400 systems that remain operationally deployed today. The doctrinal emphasis on layered defense, multiple overlapping missile systems, and centralized command and control, all developed to create engagement scenarios that might successfully target an SR-71, shaped Russian and Soviet successor state military thinking about airspace denial. The SR-71 had been retired for decades, but the infrastructure built to fight it remained operational, adapted to new threats but fundamentally unchanged in purpose. Deny the adversary the ability to penetrate national airspace with impunity. The ghost of the Blackbird still haunted Russian air defense planning. The policy implications reached beyond military hardware. The SR-71's operational record became an argument in repeated debates about human versus robotic systems, risk tolerance in intelligence collection, and the value of platforms that could be publicly acknowledged versus classified capabilities that had to remain hidden. During the 1980s and 1990s, advocates for satellite reconnaissance argued that unmanned systems eliminated the risk of pilot loss and international incidents. SR-71 proponents countered that satellites couldn't respond to emerging situations, couldn't penetrate cloud cover, and couldn't provide the resolution and flexibility that saved lives in Desert Storm when SR-71s flew reconnaissance missions over Iraq. The argument was essentially a proxy for deeper questions about whether American intelligence policy should prioritize protecting sources and methods or accepting risk to gather better information. SR-71 represented a philosophy that said sometimes you had to put people in danger to get answers that satellites and signals intelligence couldn't provide. That philosophy became increasingly difficult to defend as drone technology matured and satellite capabilities improved, but it never entirely disappeared. The political symbolism mattered as much as the practical intelligence. Every time an SR-71 flew through Soviet radar coverage and came home untouched, it demonstrated American technological confidence and Soviet inability to control their own airspace. This was soft power projected at Mach 3, a form of psychological warfare that didn't require firing shots but delivered clear messages about relative capabilities. When Mikhail Gorbachev initiated glasnost and perestroika in the mid-1980s, part of the motivation came from recognition that the Soviet Union couldn't sustain the technological competition exemplified by systems like the SR-71. The aircraft didn't end the Cold War, no single weapon system did, but it contributed to a broader Soviet realization that matching American technical innovation across the full spectrum of military capabilities was economically and technologically impossible. The arms race couldn't be won, which made arms control suddenly attractive. By the time the SR-71 program ended permanently in 1998, satellite technology had advanced to provide much of the reconnaissance capability the Blackbird once monopolized. Commercial satellite imagery was becoming available at resolutions that would have been classified a decade earlier. Unmanned aerial vehicles were demonstrating that persistent surveillance didn't require human pilots accepting enormous risk. The niche that the SR-71 filled, high-speed, high-altitude reconnaissance in heavily defended airspace, was becoming less relevant in an era where information dominance came from networks, computers, and data processing rather than pure platform performance. The Blackbird had become a magnificent anachronism, too expensive and specialized to justify in a post-Cold War budget environment where threats were diffuse and asymmetric rather than concentrated in Soviet air defense networks. Yet the absence of the SR-71 created operational gaps that remained unfilled decades later. During the 2003 Iraq War, military commanders requested real-time reconnaissance that satellites couldn't provide and UAVs couldn't survive to collect. The Air Force had no good answer. In 2014, when Russian forces occupied Crimea and operated in eastern Ukraine with sophisticated air defenses, NATO intelligence struggled to provide detailed tactical reconnaissance without violating Ukrainian airspace. An SR-71 could have flown the Baltic periphery and photographed everything within 70 miles of the border, but no such capability existed anymore. The Air Force began development of the SR-72, a hypersonic reconnaissance platform that would make the Blackbird look slow, but the program remained classified and years from operational deployment. The gap persisted. The need for what the SR-71 provided hadn't disappeared. Only the aircraft had. Major Brian Schul died in February 2023 at the age of 75, having outlived most of his contemporaries from the SR-71 program and having survived injuries that should have killed him in Vietnam, missions that should have killed him over Soviet airspace, and the simple accumulated wear of pushing human physiology to extremes for years. His obituary and military publications focused on his survival and recovery from burns that covered 65% of his body, his improbable return to flight status, and his subsequent career as an aviation photographer. The obituaries mentioned his SR-71 service, but typically didn't detail the missions, the missile engagements, the number of times he'd flown at Mach 3 while Soviet commanders tried to calculate intercept solutions that would destroy him and his aircraft. Those details remained in classified mission reports, declassified fragments, and the memories of people who'd done similar things and understood what the bland official language actually described. Schul himself had preferred to talk about the beauty of high-altitude flight, the view from 80,000 feet, the strange privilege of seeing the curve of the Earth while traveling faster than a bullet. He rarely emphasized the danger, possibly because emphasizing it made the fear real, possibly because the danger had been so constant that it became normalized, or possibly because he understood that talking about heroism made people uncomfortable while talking about amazing technology made them interested. He died having flown at speeds most people couldn't conceptualize, having survived attacks by weapon systems designed specifically to kill him, having contributed to a program that helped end the Cold War without firing a shot. His legacy was measured in mission reports and museum displays and the continued existence of a world that hadn't destroyed itself, partly because reconnaissance aircraft like the one he flew helped both sides understand each other's capabilities well enough to avoid catastrophic miscalculation. Cinematic Epilogue. The last SR-71 sits in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center, tail number 61-7972. Frozen in a dive position suspended from the ceiling where children point at it and parents take photographs without quite understanding what they're looking at. The aircraft is clean now, polished, free of the fuel stains and scorched titanium that marked operational birds. Museum placards explain that it flew reconnaissance missions, that it was the fastest air-breathing manned aircraft ever built, that it set speed records that still stand. The placards don't mention that this specific airframe encountered 87 missile launches during its operational service, that it photographed Soviet submarine bases and missile installations and military construction projects that informed presidential decisions about war and peace. The aircraft hangs silent above tourists buying commemorative t-shirts, a relic of a conflict fought in shadows and classified briefings, reduced now to impressive statistics about speed and altitude that flatten complex history into simple superlatives. Somewhere in Moscow, in climate-controlled archives that remain partially restricted, There exist documents detailing every Soviet attempt to shoot down an SR-71, the launch orders, the radar tracks, the post-mission analyses that tried to understand why thousands of missiles failed to kill a single American aircraft. Russian military historians occasionally publish papers analyzing these failed engagements, treating them as case studies in the limits of surface-to-air missile technology against extreme performance targets. The papers are technical, focused on engagement geometry and guidance system limitations, carefully avoiding the larger question of what it meant that the Soviet Union's most advanced air defense networks couldn't stop American reconnaissance platforms from photographing anything they wanted. That question has political implications that remain sensitive even 3 decades after the Soviet collapse. Better to focus on missile trajectories and radar cross-sections, problems that can be solved with better engineering, than confront the reality that entire defense systems were fundamentally inadequate against a determined adversary with superior technology. In a storage facility at Beale Air Force Base, mission films from thousands of SR-71 sorties remain archived on magnetic tape, gradually degrading despite controlled storage conditions. The Air Force transfers some of them to digital format when funding and priorities align, but much of the footage remains unviewed since the original intelligence analysis was completed decades ago. The tapes contain images of Soviet missile facilities that no longer exist, military installations that have been abandoned or converted to civilian use, coastlines photographed from altitudes where the curvature of Earth made them look abstract and unreal. The footage is technically obsolete. Modern satellites provide better resolution and update coverage continuously, but the historical record it contains is unique, irreplaceable, and slowly vanishing as magnetic particles randomize and storage media fails. Future historians may find themselves unable to verify details of Cold War military construction because the evidence degraded in storage while everyone focused on digital futures and forgot to preserve analog pasts. The engineers who designed the SR-71's propulsion system, its titanium structure, its reconnaissance sensors, are mostly dead or retired, their expertise dispersed or lost. Kelly Johnson died in 1990, having seen his creation outlast the Soviet Union it was built to spy on. The institutional knowledge of how to build an aircraft capable of sustained Mach 3 flight exists in technical documents and engineering drawings, but the tacit expertise, the judgment calls about material stress and aerodynamic trade-offs that couldn't be fully captured in blueprints, exists now only in fragmentary form. When the Air Force considered restarting SR-71 production in the 1990s, Lockheed engineers discovered that some manufacturing processes couldn't be replicated because the people who'd developed them had retired without fully documenting their methods. The SR-71 could theoretically be built again, but practically it was a one-time achievement, created by a specific team with specific capabilities that wouldn't be assembled again. The aircraft hanging in the museum represented not just one program's success, but an entire approach to aerospace engineering that had been displaced by computer-aided design, risk-averse development processes, and procurement systems that stretched programs across decades instead of completing them in years. Brian Shule's pressure suit, the one he wore during Giant Scope 24 and dozens of other missions, was donated to the Air Force Museum after his death. It hangs in a climate-controlled storage area alongside hundreds of other artifacts waiting for display space, preservation funding, or curatorial interest. The suit is personalized with Shule's name stenciled on the chest, stained with sweat and fuel residue that survived cleaning attempts, marked with wear patterns that show how a human body compressed against restraints during high-G maneuvers. It's an intimate object, this suit. It held a human being together in an environment that would have killed him in seconds, sealed him against vacuum and heat and cold. Became a kind of portable spacecraft for a man riding a missile disguised as an airplane. Without Shule inside it, the suit looks deflated, incomplete, a shell that only makes sense in context of the person it protected. Archivists cataloged it carefully, noting the damage and wear, the modifications Shule had made for comfort, the signatures of squadron mates written in permanent marker on surfaces that wouldn't be visible when worn. They cataloged everything except the fear that must have been soaked into the fabric, the adrenaline spike that came with every missile launch warning, the relief of landing safely one more time. Those things aren't preserved in museums. They existed only in the moment, in the bodies of people who flew missions that remain partially classified 40 years later, in the accumulated stress that shortened lifespans and broke marriages and created memories that couldn't be fully shared with anyone who hadn't done the same things. The suit hangs in storage, waiting, outliving the man who wore it and the aircraft he flew, and possibly the memory of why any of it mattered enough to risk everything.